Welcome back to Sociology 226. This is Erving Goffman, video 2. In this video, I've got 3 goals. First, I'm going to explore Goffman's stigma and asylums. After that, I'm going to look to Goffman's critique of mental illness, understood solely through psychiatric discourse, and responses to that critique. Finally, this will get you ready for your 2-paragraph response. Let's do it. After Stigma, Asylums is Goffman's most famous work. I'll look at it first. Here, Goffman continues his ethnographic work. In this case, and with permission of the upper management, Goffman posed as the assistant to the athletic director of a large mental hospital. Goffman spent most of his year there talking with patients and observed the way that they interacted with staff. All of Goffman's work takes a mundane ethnography as its object. In Asylums, an ethnography of mental illness, as the sporting director's assistant. Goffman treats the asylum as a total institution, which has characteristics that are shared by many settings. Most importantly, they tend to be isolated from wider society. There is a boundary between what goes on inside and what goes on outside, with different mechanisms of information transfer between them. Be it a hospital, a residential school, jail, or a concentration camp, there are explicit walls that keep people and information in and people and information out. They can be bypassed depending on the type of institution, but they exist nonetheless. In almost every case, there will be a permanent population of people who reside in the institution, the inmates, and there are those who operate it. There are residents and there are staff. Not only can one population leave and the other remain, but there is a significant social difference between those two ranks. This social division, and the associated fronts that come up with them, are the basis of the interaction that Goffman maps throughout that book. Goffman's approach is once again dramaturgical, in that he's focusing on the interaction of people in relation to others, against the stage of total institutions. One of the essays in Asylums is titled "The Moral Career of the Mental Patient," one of the best in the collection. Goffman uses the word moral in exactly the same sense that Durkheim uses it, in terms of the interpersonal attachments that come up as people start to live in the institution. This isn't a morality of you should or you must, but the ties that we establish between one another. Goffman traces how individuals come to be outfitted for the life of the institution and committed to the fronts and social roles that operate in the asylum. There is a specific transition away from family life or life in the community to life in the asylum. This is the moral career of the mental patient. When committed, people carve out new forms of identity and have new forms of identity thrust on them by the interpersonal interaction in the institution. Goffman tells us that many of the interactions that people and staff have in the institution, from the point of view of the staff, are used as justification for why the patient is so admitted. Part of maintaining the social distance between staff and patients is justifying why people are in the institution in the first place. And this is a constantly unfolding story. The following essay in the collection is "The Underlife of a Public Institution." Also excellent. In that essay, Goffman is interested in the little ways that individuals who are committed to the institution define themselves, within and sometimes in contrast to the rules that are imposed on them. It would seem, at first sight, that a strict divide between patients and staff would mean that each of the two camps would be relatively equal. Goffman explores how little hierarchies would develop among the residents of the mental hospital. He documents, for instance, how inmates with work assignments would use those positions to gain relative authority over others in the institution, how they would use these privileges to demonstrate their status or authority. This would mean access to spaces restricted to others without a work assignment, say, or parts of common grounds, like the yard, that would only be made available to those with the prestige accorded to them. At the time, in 1956, everyone smoked, even the inmates. A small barter currency existed with cigarettes in the institution. One would be able to express their relative prestige or authority over others in small ways, like the possession of a secret stash of accumulated goods, something that would show the importance of an inmate over others. The ability to have and transport goods that were otherwise not allowed to be possessed in public was a sign of what differentiated a particular resident over another. What does Goffman mean by the quote on the slide? He's making a general inference about the organization of societies. He says even when we take away all of the things that make us who we are, a job, an apartment, an outside identity, when existence is cut to the bone, people will find tiny ways to mark themselves as individuals against the stage on which they are performing. Before we finish with Asylums, I want to say I think it's one of the best sociology books ever written. It reads like a time capsule from the 50s about the anxieties of the time, but is still very pertinent today. Stigma is Goffman's most famous book. We use the term all the time, as in the stigma of mental illness. Well, if you're going to write a paper on the stigma of anything, you usually start with Goffman. But I want to situate it against the general project that Goffman's trying to do. I want to position this against the lay understanding of stigma. Goffman isn't just trying to identify the discrediting mark that an individual has placed on them. I think this is what most people do when they say something is stigmatized. It has a negative social connotation that it shouldn't, and if that thing wasn't stigmatized, the world would be better. Yes, I think Goffman would agree that mental illness shouldn't be stigmatized, and that we shouldn't have weight stigma, or whatever. But his interest is in how people navigate their lives around that mark of difference. So, to return to our example, Goffman isn't just simply saying mental illness has a bunch of social baggage. He's interested in how people carry that baggage around with them, and the way that interpersonal interaction is altered because of this. So, for example, when someone comes out as gay, polyamorous, with a learning disability, as whatever, there is a particular tactic they'll use to do so. That they were in hiding because of X, Y, or Z was bad isn't the point, at least to Goffman, but rather how we organize our lives with that understanding. This difference is really important. It isn't the mark that is especially interesting, but how we live with it. This is what Goffman means by impression management. A key insight in stigma is that it isn't just difference that is performed. Normalcy, too, is an ongoing, interactive achievement. Goffman makes clear that we won't learn much about stigma from a sociological perspective if we simply document all the things that are stigmatized. This is simply accounting for blemishes and not for the way that normalcy is produced and maintained in our societies. Part of this story is about passing, ways that we attempt to produce ourselves as normal, despite the perceived mark on our identities. Most of you know this story about passing. You've had a few drinks, and the LCBO is going to close in 15 minutes, and you just didn't buy enough lemon gin, or whatever you students drink these days, and you need to present yourself as sober enough to buy more. In this case, we need to pass ourselves off as normal, and give off the little gestures, etc., that make up normal behavior. Goffman is saying that these moments are the little rituals that make up what normal is, and the sociology of stigma is the documentation of the ways that all of us accomplish this in our daily lives. Reading the quote on the slide, I think you get the point. Everyone has something that at some point will deviate from normalcy and will need to be brought in line. What matters is not the little things that cross the line, but the line itself. Now that we've explored those two big books, let's look to Goffman on mental illness. In Asylums, Goffman is rather agnostic about the nature of mental illness. Regardless of the reasons why people came to the institution, they are there. Regardless of whether mental illness is real, it shapes the way that we present ourselves and receive others. Much of the work of the institution comes in keeping people in their place once they are there. In Asylums, Goffman is reserved about whether mental illness is real, rather interested in how it shapes collective life. In the short essay you read, Goffman is much more explicit about the role of the sociology of mental illness. He says, in the quote you can see here, that before we can identify something as a symptom of mental illness, we find that it shapes collective life first. One is only hyperactive in this view when they disrupt the classroom environment. Then one is coded as a hyperactive child, then assessed, and so on. If we want to get the whole story about what hyperactivity is, we need to look to the way it shaped that initial classroom moment. Goffman's position is that when we chronicle the moral career of the hyperactive child, we have to locate that symptom in an initial moment. That career is retroactively assembled as warning signs that people should have noticed beforehand. Mental illness, then, is recast as a social problem. Accordingly, Goffman's critique moves from symptoms to psychiatric discourse itself. In Asylums, Goffman is pretty reserved about his disdain for institutional psychiatry. In the piece you read, he's pretty open about it. I'll quote it for you. "Few professions have so well been able to institutionalize, to sell on the social market, their own fantasies of what they were engaged in doing." This is pretty darn explicit. Psychiatrists see themselves as healers. Really, at least according to Goffman, they are either accidentally or intentionally policing socially acceptable behavior with medical terminology. We know this, at least he argues, in the fact that outside of the particular situation, many of these improprieties wouldn't have been infractions at all. Think about so-called crazy ex-girlfriends, in air quotes. I'm sure you've all been talking to some dude at a party who says, "Oh man, my ex was so crazy." And then, like the critical sociology student that you are, you start to wonder if she was treated like garbage by the guy telling you the story and reacted accordingly. By exploring the situation in which the impropriety occurred, we find out this was really a story about interpersonal interaction gone wrong, and not a story about mental illness. In this instance, Cody gaslighting his ex-girlfriend. Cody. We can come up with 2 degrees of argument here. The strong claim, then, is that institutional psychiatry is involved in simply maintaining a partial story of social order and not healing sickness. The weaker claim, however, is that there are always improprieties associated with a particular form of mental illness, and that sociologists should look at them. Is psychiatry just a form of social control, or does it just take place in a social context? I leave it to you to come up with a position on the matter. Let's contrast Goffman with Parsons' sick role. Parsons' sick role doesn't move much. It's a place in the social structure that someone occupies or doesn't. You're either sick or you're not. You either are obligated this way or the other way. Things for Goffman are different. We locate his understanding of mental illness in the forms of co-presence and the types of behavior located therein. His is also situated in the hospital, in the classroom. While Parsons talks about the sick role, he doesn't talk about the stage where it plays out. Parsons' sick role emerges because it needs to. We can't keep a social action system going unless we have ways to deal with those who don't play their part. It is a response to social strain. It is a normal response to abnormal systemic action. For Goffman, mental illness is a performance recognized as abnormal, the other side of the same coin. There are stigmatized identities that we all possess in one form or another. We put the normal to work as we hide them, as we try to pass as normal. There isn't really a larger picture to overall social action, as in structural functionalism, just tiny snippets of interactive life. Finally, I think Parsons' sick role is far more focused on the management of the patient. It is something to be studied scientifically by the relevant scientists. As we see in Asylums, Goffman, however, is far more interested in how we live with and around mental health rather than how we restore it. Erving Goffman's work is not without criticism, both internally from sociologists and externally from mental health professionals. First, on mental health. Goffman usually gets lumped in with a bunch of people referred to as anti-psychiatrists, others making the strong claim that I mentioned earlier. The reply from those whose business it is to treat mental illness is pretty clear. You are arguing that mental illness isn't real, but it is. Yes, you're right. We must situate all mental symptoms in their proper context. But just because they are socially situated doesn't mean that they are pretend. What would a non-situated psychiatry or psychology even look like? If anything, to pursue the kinds of critiques that Goffman is making might contribute to the problems faced by those with mental illness, because it makes the blemish of getting help even worse than it currently is, forcing people to pass when they might go to the doctor. This belongs to the strong claim of the argument rather than the soft one. But these were the kinds of critiques being launched at Goffman by mental health professionals. Secondly, there are two critiques from within sociology. Lots of people have criticized Goffman's work from the Marxist perspective. Even if Goffman turns his attention away from the individual form of stigma itself, of mental health or whatever, in light of the ways that we live with and around stigmatized identities, Goffman doesn't really come close to describing how they are caused. Where is the focus on material life? Marxists will say, look, it doesn't really matter how we feel about or interpret the various forms of exclusion that you talk about in stigma. The point, however, is to change them. Now, that said, these are exactly the same sorts of critiques that Marxists will say about anything that isn't about capitalism, so take all that with a grain of salt. Finally, there's the question of social structure. I know all of you probably like the idea that we are all performing all the time. Just walking down the street, you are doing it, or ordering a beer. But one of the most important questions to pose to Goffman is, how is it that we take on a common type of performance? Are we totally free to perform however we want, or does something dictate how and why we do that? The point here is that Goffman doesn't offer a lot more than a description of action, and cannot account for its regularity. He doesn't really deal with the agency structure problem. That's it for me. Now it's your turn. In 2 paragraphs, between 5 to 8 sentences in length, and with reference to the readings, 1. Explain Goffman's stigma via the stigma of mental illness. 2. Show how that approach differs from that of Talcott Parsons' sick role. Remember, for full marks, you're going to have to engage with the readings. See you next week.